Hello and welcome to the Student Undergraduate Research Experience program at the University of Saskatchewan. My name is Merle Massey. I'm the coordinator of the Undergraduate Research Initiative. And with us today is our special guest, Jill McMillan from the University of Saskatchewan Library. I jokingly call Sure the Jill and Merle show because I think Jill presents, I don't know, like probably a quarter of the things, and I present quite a few as well of the things that we give out to you through the SURE program. But Jill is here with us today to talk about literature reviews, how to analyze and organize sources. And with that, Jill, over to you.
So thank you for inviting me here to present this morning. I'll turn my camera off just because I get a bit distracted seeing myself when I'm speaking, but I'll turn it back on at the end so you know that I'm still here. So this is the first of two sessions that I'm going to be leading on the topic of literature reviews, simply because these are very common in terms of what we're expected to produce as undergraduates. And if you're doing a lot of research, I would not be surprised if a literature review is part of your deliverable. And two, because these texts, these text types have so many different moving parts, it's nice to sort of break it up, chunk it up a little bit so that we appreciate the multiple steps that we have to take when conducting a literature review. So today our focus is really about managing all of those sources that feed into this document. So before we get into all of the fun around that, I just want to, again, quickly introduce myself. So my name is Jill, and if you have any questions, you can always send me an email directly, jill.mcmillan@usask.ca. I'm a learning specialist within the university library, and I help graduate students, but I also help upper level undergraduate students as well. If you're not familiar with some of the different writing supports at the university, I just wanted to spotlight some of them here. So we have the Writing Help Center, which is a fantastic and free resource available to all USask students. And you can receive feedback either via email or through virtual appointments. And then there is the USask Writing Help Guide that compiles a lot of information together. And next week, if you are working on a project and you want to be part of a supportive community, you are more than welcome to join us for the virtual graduate writing retreat. So it's open to upper year undergraduate students as well. And it runs all day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and you can attend as many or as few sessions as you would like.
And I'm going to jump in and let you guys know that we're
Yes.
going to have another writing retreat that Jill and I are going to run for the SURE program in August.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too. As I suggested, the review really is a text that has all these different moving parts to it. So we have a major focus, of course, research, just gathering all of those sources together that you can then review. And then you have to analyze and engage with those sources, and then you have to put it all together and write the text. And as much as we might pretend that this is a linear process, in reality, it's much more mobile. So you might have thought that you completed all of your research, and then suddenly someone tells you about a new study that was just published in a leading journal. And so you'd have to go back and engage with that and analyze that, and then maybe do some restructuring accordingly. So that's what is both fun and frustrating, I think, about the research process, is that we want to keep on top of all of the new research that is coming out. So our second session for literature reviews will focus more on the writing and the structuring of the literature review. And today's focus is more about figuring out what to do with all of those sources. So you're probably very deeply immersed in that research process right now, gathering all of these sources, all this literature together. So these other questions start to emerge. Well, how are you actually meant to engage with them? And I know you have an upcoming session, for instance, on reading journal articles. And so that is going to be connected, I think, a little bit to what we're discussing today. But then how do you actually keep track and make sense of all of this information? Because it's very easy to get overwhelmed by the volume of literature that you are sourcing. So our focus today is to look at strategies for engaging with sources. And I sort of give the plot away because really it's all about the questions that we ask. And then we're going to focus on strategies for organizing sources. And some of these suggestions might resonate with you more than others. And I think that's going to be a takeaway, is trying to figure out, of some of these different methods, which one is going to make the most sense to you as a researcher, which will you be able to maintain for the research project in question. So we're going to look at making use of tables, we're going to look at mind mapping, and we're also going to look at annotated bibliographies. So one of the things that I think it's so important to do in the research process is to give yourself permission to critique. And this can be a bit unnerving because we might think, well, how am I fit to criticize the work of this person who has a PhD and decades of experience and a dozen publications? What critical perspective can I actually bring to this study in question that I'm reading about? I think what we need to be mindful of is that, yes, there are gold standards when it comes to research, but we need to distinguish between what gold standards are versus perfection, because I would argue that no perfect study actually exists. We might have very, very high quality studies, but perfect ones are very rare if they exist at all, because it would be all about how you're defining perfection. Because the reality is researchers face many different constraints when they are pursuing a research question. They might have issues with funding, there might be issues with time, so not having enough time, there might be some ethical considerations that prevent people from running studies the way in which they might want. So we're not taking children, for instance, and raising them in laboratories, because even though this might generate a lot of interesting information, that would be a terrible thing to do to those children. So we want to remind ourselves that yes, we might be looking at very high quality research, but we still have perspectives and criticism that we can bring. So just a quick refresher of some research methods, or some areas around research methodology that you're probably well versed in. But think of all the different forms of bias that exist when we're conducting research. There might be researcher bias, there might be participant bias, there might be measurement bias, there might be sampling bias. So depending on your area of research, if you're in the social sciences, for instance, you might encounter a lot of what are referred to as weird studies, where the participants are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, or they're disproportionately representing that sort of culture. And it's simply because it's very, very easy for faculty to make use of university students in their research studies. So in a lot of the published literature, there's a bias toward this type of cultural group simply because of the ease of accessing those demographics. But there are other considerations that we can bring in our reading of someone's study. Maybe the researchers haven't considered an urban or rural divide. Maybe there's underrepresentation of different groups, be it along the lines of gender, age, religion, etc., etc. So often, even though we might think, oh, I don't have enough experience or expertise to really comment on the quality of someone else's work, often we do have a different perspective that we can bring. And so we want to ensure that we feel confident to bring that level of critique to our reading. So what we want to do is ask targeted questions. And this is going to be useful because it's going to help us think more deeply about the literature that we are reading. But I also recognize that it can be challenging if you're doing research outside of your area of expertise, because you have to distinguish, well, okay, what is or isn't relevant. So you want to strategize in advance. If you are creating your own study, having a very focused research question will help reduce the number of results, so it will make it easier to actually manage that volume of literature that might be generated when you're looking. And if you're working as part of a team, you can have conversations with your project lead to determine different things like your search strategy, your research aims, inclusion and exclusion criteria. So for instance, if you're looking at, let's say, housing accessibility, where are you looking in the world? It's going to be too difficult to look at the entire world. So are you looking at housing in a Canadian context, in a British context, in an American context, in a Saskatchewan context, in a Saskatoon context? The more narrow that is, it's going to help create a greater sense of focus and will allow you to develop your expertise because some of that expertise will start to emerge the more immersed you are in the literature that you are reading. If you're restricting your search to experimental versus observational data, et cetera, again, this will help to narrow that focus and also help you to develop your awareness of what constitutes good research in that context or for that research question. So what kind of questions should you ask when you are engaging with literature? Let's take, let's say 2 minutes or so, and just put some suggestions in the chat. What are some of the questions that you like to ask when you are reading academic literature? We have so many great questions coming in. I encourage you to keep typing. I'm just going to start summarizing some of them. As much for the recording because the chat won't be captured. So when was it written? So time of publication, is it timely? And sometimes that's going to be really, really important. It's going to be very much shaped by the research question as well. Who funded it? That's always such a great question because if you have industry partners, sometimes we might act with a little bit more not suspicion, but we might be more alert in terms of potential biases around the interpretation of the results or the research design, especially if we're concerned that it might be structured to benefit a research partner in a particular way. Who is the research for? Another excellent question. Is there recognition or disclosure of potential biases? And often you will see toward the end of a journal article or within a monograph reference to the limitations and potential biases, but sometimes people won't necessarily surface this. Do we have appropriate sample sizes? What was the context of publication? So who actually published it? What journal? Is it a reputable journal? Is it a predatory journal where there are less safeguards around peer review, for instance? Who is the research intended for? Do we have clear hypotheses? Do we have appropriate outcomes? Do we have a recognition that the conclusions actually match the analyses? Do we have a detailed enough methodology that's going to allow for reproducibility? Is the information actually clearly presented or is it kind of confusing? And certainly when you look at how some scholars review the work of other scholars, they will comment on the clarity of how tables were organized or the quality of the prose, for instance, because like, it is very, very easy to massage a language or figures to be somewhat confusing. And sometimes people might want to do that to diminish someone's understanding of what the takeaway is. Perhaps we see this a little bit less in academia, but certainly in politics, I think we see politicians making use of language in this very deliberate way. What about the implications of the exclusion criteria? So is this going to impact the quality of the overall research? What was the timeline? Again, questions around how a reader is engaging and understanding the text. Do we have appropriate statistical methods? Did the majority of subject results get included, or has there been some slicing of data? So this notion of salami slicing is a bit of an issue in academia, and people do this in order to take a research project and try and get more publications out of it because of pressures of trying to get tenure, for instance, but that then can lead to some published research that isn't of a particularly high quality. So recognizing that we have so many questions that we can ask can also help us engage critically with the information that we've gathered. So thank you so much for that contribution. I'm going to go through some additional questions that we might ask that relate to things like purpose, value, quality of sources, methodology, results and data, discussion, and our own thoughts. And I think that last category is always really key because that's where it demonstrates how closely invested and engaged we are with the research at hand. And asking those critical questions can then help us frame how we think about our own research and our own approach for investigating our research questions. So we're going to see some overlap here with all of the wonderful suggestions that were surfaced in the chat, but let's just go through them quickly. So in terms of purpose, well, what problem has been identified? What does the study intend to do? And does it achieve its purpose? Sometimes we intend to do one thing and we actually discover that we sort of go off on a tangent, and that's fine. It can generate novel results, but then we'd want to just see, well, is there a mismatch there? And have they failed to recognize this mismatch? In terms of value, what knowledge will the study contribute to the field? Is the research question worth investigating? Because frankly, there are many, many research questions we could ask and investigate, but not all have a lot of value behind them. So is someone just investigating something that's not actually that important? What about sources? Are the sources of sufficient range and or quality? Where are these texts getting published? So if you go and look at someone else's bibliography or works cited page, that will give you a sense of how they are framing their investigation. And that's one thing that is a really valuable habit to get into, is when you're looking at someone else's work to almost look at their references first in order to get a sense of how they understand their context for investigation. Methodology: who or what was studied, how was this rationalized, what tools were used and why. So if someone is studying a fairly popular topic, but they're using an unconventional tool, what's the justification for that? And do you see value in that rationale that they've created? What type of data was collected? Why did they collect this sort of data? How did they actually collect it? What controls were used? Was the method appropriate for answering the research question? Were appropriate statistical tests used? That's echoing one of the last suggestions in the chat. In terms of results and data, any surprises? That's something that can be awesome in academia, encountering surprises. But at the same time, if you had um, a different outcome, a different expected outcome, then the researcher really needs to ensure that they're not hiding those surprises or diminishing those surprises. So how are they actually engaging with information that they didn't expect to gather? Are they gathering information that might be generalizable? Is there sufficient data? How was the data actually presented? And the discussion, how do they interpret the data that they've collected? What are the strengths and limitations of this interpretation? This is an area where you can really engage and bring your own critical questioning in a little bit more deeply, whether that is to acknowledge those strengths, right? Because critique is not all about being negative. It's about just going a bit more deeply with our reading of material. And does the author use logical fallacies when interpreting results? So are they making use of illogic, basically, in order to justify their claims? And then those own thoughts that we want to keep in mind at all times. Well, what are the strengths, weaknesses, and or limitations of the study overall? How does the work relate to other relevant theories or ideas? So this is where you're starting to think about one study in relation to other studies or other ideas in your field. What other experiments, methodology, or investigation could test the stated conclusion? What assumptions do the authors make, and are they justified? Is there any reason to suggest that the author is biased in his or her views? Can the results be generalized beyond the scope of the study or experiment? What are the practical implications of the findings? So is this something that will have policy implications, for instance? Who funded the study? Who are the key stakeholders? What should be done moving forward? And if you were to meet the author or authors, what would you like to ask them? And that might sound like a silly question, but think about if you were to attend a conference and you were to go to a poster session, for instance, and you were having a chat with the person who is presenting the poster, what sort of conversation would you have about the study in question? It's the same sort of thing that we can think about when engaging with published work. All right, so let's put those questions aside for a moment. And my question to you is, how do you currently organize your research? So if you're in the midst of generating all of these results when you're searching, how are you keeping track of all of this information? So let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. Again, we have a range of strategies. And this is why I love asking these sort of questions, because often people sort of cobble together strategies or figure out strategies on their own, or they've been told by a professor long ago of how to approach organization. And the reality is that it's not that there's one necessarily best choice for organizing your sources. If you are feeling that you're overwhelmed and that your sources don't feel organized, then that is an opportunity to explore some different organizational strategies in order to minimize your stress and anxiety around keeping all of this information compiled in a way that's going to make sense for you. So we have a range of strategies that have been identified. So some of you are looking forward to learning more about reference managers. I won't be discussing that in detail, but I will be referencing how you can find out more. And then we have pinch tables of evidence, or Mendeley, which is a ref manager, a Word document full of notes, paper methods, just having stacks of paper all over the place, electronic file folders, thinking about names in a particular way, all that kind of stuff. So let's just we'll look at three different approaches. And ultimately, I think that one of the takeaways is sometimes these are used complementary to each other. And what's going to be important for you in order, again, to help with any stress that you have around keeping files organized for your reference is to figure out which strategies you can actually commit to and follow. Because it's one thing to have a system in place, and it's another to actually follow that system. So I tend to be a bit more scattershot with my organization, depending on the context. So I'm always trying to figure out, how can I improve this situation for myself? So I empathize if anyone else feels a little bit scattered when it comes to organization. But one of the things when you're doing a really big project, citation management software can be very valuable. And there are three really popular ones: EndNote, Mendeley, and Zotero. And basically, because probably 99% or more of a lot of scholars' research when it comes to gathering literature is now online. What this does is it helps to keep track of the citation of the sources that you're accessing, and it helps to capture those citations so that you're not having to write them in a Word document, for instance. So I'm not an expert on this topic whatsoever, but there might be a presentation coming up. But if you're eager to learn right now, this afternoon, you can look at different LibGuides on the library website, and there are also workshop recordings of previous sessions that are also available on our website. And if you're interested in getting those links, I can pop them into the chat at the end of today's session. So one of the things I think that's also important to keep, oh, perfect. One of the things that is also important, though, is to keep track of your keywords and the databases that you are accessing, because you don't want to have to replicate effort, and you might actually have to identify this in your methodology, depending on the nature of the research that you are conducting and the deliverable that you're constructing. If your main deliverable is a literature review, often there will be reference to how you source that information. And so identifying keywords and databases will be important. When it comes to organizing, tracking, and commenting on the literature, this is where tables and matrices are often very valuable, in part because it's going to help protect against accidental plagiarism. It's very easy when you are reading so much, especially so much related material, that line between what other people are saying or writing rather, and your own thoughts can easily become blurred. And so ensuring that you know where information comes from can just help prevent that from happening. Another strategy that can be useful when it comes to organizing sources is making use of annotated bibliographies, and we'll be looking at those in a little bit later in today's session. So here is a sample organizational chart. So it's not quite a pinch table, but it has some shared DNA, I would suggest. But basically, the quality of an organizational chart is that it can become very personalized, which makes it very attractive because you can decide what are the bits of information that are going to be most valuable to you when it comes to revisiting some of these sources, if you need to revisit some of these sources as you're writing up your literature review. So here we just have a sample organizational chart. and we're looking at the topic of interventions that reduce the likelihood of bone fractures among elderly populations. And here we just have the beginning of an organizational chart where we've identified a handful of sources. So we have 4 sources. Ideally, you would have the full citation information so that you could go and easily access that. For our purposes, I've just put in the author and the year. And then we have the research focus. So what is the main question? What is the main point of investigation for these studies? Here we have stem cell injections, exercise regimes, diet, and another exercise regime. Then we're looking at methodology, clinical trial, mixed methods, longitudinal study, and another longitudinal study. And then some of those strengths and limitations. And those strengths and limitations, here we've kept them very, very generic, referencing specifically the methodology, but there might be other strengths or limitations that you would layer in here. So for instance, if one study had a really robust sample size, but another had a very small sample size. And it's not that the sample size, sample size is important, but mostly important in context of how the study is being structured. So it might be a limitation, but in some cases it might not be. But basically you would just be able to add additional columns if you wanted to, and you can put in information that's going to help you remember, oh, yes, I want to go back and look at that study again because I'm going to reference it more closely in my literature review. Another major advantage to having something visual like this is that it's going to help with those first steps toward synthesis. We're going to be discussing synthesis a little bit today, and then a little bit more so during the next session on literature reviews. But basically what we're doing is at a glance, we start to see those points of comparison, those points of similarity. So when we look at just this small sampling, we have 2 studies that are focused on exercise in relation to the research question. And so when it comes to organizing those sources in extended prose, like we do in the literature review, we know that I might pair these 2 studies because of this commonality. We also have some other commonalities in terms of the methodology. So depending on how you want to structure your review, you might cluster around methodology, or you might cluster around research focus. You have the decision to make when it comes to how you want to thematically group that information, which is part of the puzzle and the fun of writing. But ultimately, this is going to help create for a much easier compare and contrast. So synthesis is so important because it's demonstrating our awareness of how studies relate to each other. In its most basic sense, it's a form of pattern recognition. And from a deliverable perspective, what it does is it helps to ensure that we're not just listing sources when writing up a literature review. It's going to push us to think more thematically, and that is going to help create a greater sense of narrative when we're putting this information together, and that is what our reader will respond more positively to. So here we might have a synthesis matrix, very similar to our organizational chart, but I wanted to just feature this to show that sometimes, depending on how those columns are titled, you wouldn't necessarily have any information in there. And this is just going to be reflective of the fact that some studies aren't going to be looking at all of the same elements, or they might not have the same methodology, for instance. But what you start to see is the more you have, the more entries you have in specific columns in relation to the different studies, you start to see some of these patterns emerge in their complexity. and it can help you start to think about how you're going to present this information in linear prose. So to just look at synthesis in a bit more, in a closer manner, let's look at these two samples of writing and ask, which do we prefer and why? And feel free to contribute in the chat. So sample 1 reads as follows. Baptiste reviewed 85 instances of elderly women who experienced hip fractures following falls. He determined that in the majority of cases, these falls were preventable. Beyond the physiological impact of these falls, the cost associated with such injuries was significant. Adams also studied instances of elderly women experiencing hip fractures in her study. According to her research, most of these falls were preventable. In 2018, Statistics Canada released a report on the costs associated with bone fractures in elderly populations, which often result in expensive hospitalizations. These injuries are often caused by falls and are largely preventable. Sample 2. Bone fractures in elderly populations are commonly associated with falls, the majority of which are preventable. Costs associated with bone fractures are significant as these injuries are responsible for costly hospital stays. Of the two, which do you prefer and why? Let's just take a minute and contribute in the chat. Starting to see some preference for the second sample because of a preference for information that's presented more concisely. We do lose a little bit of information from sample 1. We don't have reference to the sample size, for instance, in the Baptiste study, but we have far less repetition, which when space is at a premium is so important. And when we want to engage our readers, often they are going to prefer something that is a little bit more concise. That being said, often what we see is we'll often see information presented in that second sample, but then if you want to highlight a specific study because you have a reason to do so, maybe because you want to surface it as an exemplar, then you could layer in some information related to one of those studies. But this is speaking generally, excuse me, to a general preference for synthesis because of its ability to reduce repetition and improve readability. Excuse me. Okay, so continuing with our discussion of the strategies that we can make use of to organize all that information. We sidestepped a little bit with synthesis. If you want to make use of Excel, this can be more effective for keeping information together and keeping it organized compared to a Word table. Word can have some issues in terms of its stability, especially with longer and more complex documents. And Excel, you have the potential to then move things around to sort information in a meaningful way. So there are some advantages if you're comfortable working with Excel. So I just wanted to spotlight two resources for you. I'm not an Excel expert, but both of these strategies come quite highly recommended. So the first is Dr. Elaine Gregerson's How I Use Excel to Manage My Literature Review. And the second is Dr. Raul Pacheco Vega's Conceptualized Synthesis Excel Dump Technique. And what's great is that he actually provides on his website a template that you can download. So if you are interested in learning more, you can just go to his site. He's a really good resource generally when it comes to literature reviews. He has a lot of experience writing them and publishing, and what's great is that he does share this template so that you can download it and decide if you want to use it for your own research. Another way in which we might approach organization, and this sort of corresponds with, it's a little bit of brainstorming layered in with analysis. And and I guess analysis is part of brainstorming, but it's something that you can enter into at different points in your research. So you might initially have a general structure in mind when it comes to how you might organize, but as you're reading, you might determine that, actually, I have to put some of those initial assumptions aside and rework this. And what's nice about mind mapping is that it encourages some playfulness and encourages you to think about patterns in a meaningful way. So with a literature review broadly, we'd think about that introduction and then central themes, sub-themes, and sub-sub-themes. So if we go back to that topic of bone fractures in elderly populations, we might initially think, okay, well, we'll have the introduction and we'll focus on bone density, interventions, costs, and demographic shifts. And I have a couple of sub-themes and sub-sub-themes layered in. But as I'm actually reading and thinking more deeply about this topic, I start to realize there might be a more effective way in which to approach the organization of my review. So we have the flexibility to reorganize, and the cost, the time cost, the potential time loss is much less at this stage compared to if we've already written 10 pages in a review, because it's always a little bit more difficult to move the actual prose around. I mean, we certainly do that as part of revision, but if we can do some of that restructuring a little bit before we start writing the review, it can help us manage our time a little bit more. So it might be that actually, there are really two central themes here. And I'm going to take that reference to the demographic shifts and those costs, and I'm just going to incorporate them into the introduction, because this is what's helping to provide justification for the project and for the research, but it's actually not the main research focus. It's the justification to then think about, well, what interventions are actually the best and which is the most cost effective. All right. So now we're going to look at our last method, which is annotated bibliography. And this is a means by which we take that citation and we create an annotation that starts to reflect our emerging analysis of the source in question. So it's going to help remind ourselves, well, what did we actually read? What are the takeaways of the source? And how do these sources relate to each other? So depending on the way in which you want to start forming the foundation for your literature review, this can have some advantages because you'll be writing more intensely. So even though the annotations can be as long or short as you like, ultimately you are producing more text than you would perhaps in a table. So it gets you in that habit of writing. So here we have a sample annotation. The authors study the impact of a robotic cat, JustoCat, on the mood and behavior of 4 persons living with dementia. The researchers used a mixed methods design that incorporated the Cohen-Mansfield Agitation Inventory and Quality of Life in Late-Stage Dementia Scale. Information gathered from these instruments was supplemented with interviews with professional caregivers and relatives. The JustoCat intervention was shown to have some positive benefits, but the limitations of the small sample size mean that results must be cautiously interpreted. The authors acknowledge this weakness and likewise discuss how uncontrolled variables, such as extra attention given to participants, may have biased the results. Despite the project's limitations, the researchers conclude that the JustoCat has merits as a therapeutic intervention and can be practically implemented due to its hygienic design and ease of use. Of concern is author affiliation with the company that produces JustoCat, as one author appears in promotional video for the product, speaking to possible conflicts of interest. However, for the purposes of my own research, this article reinforces that more frequent monitoring is needed to better assess the impact of interventions within this population group, given the often variable symptomology associated with dementia, which theoretically could be achieved through an AI-enhanced care bot. All right, So we're sort of continuing with that theme, looking at elderly populations. For a bit of context, this is JustoCat. It is a robotic cat. It mimics a lifelike cat, but without fear of the cat biting, scratching, and not having to worry about hygienic matters when it comes to taking care of a live cat. And so interventions like this are increasingly used in nursing homes and with individuals who are experiencing dementia as sort of a soothing intervention to make to help relax and calm them. So there are robotic cats, there are robotic seals, different interventions that are emerging to help improve people's quality of life. It's a very interesting work. But for our purposes, let's break that sample annotation down a little bit. So basically, again, unless this is dictated by someone else, you have a lot of flexibility for how you want to approach your annotations. But I would suggest that you always want to make sure that it's going to ultimately be of use to you. So yes, to remind yourself of what the study did, you want to have project overview and methods and information on the results and interpretation. You also want, oh, sorry, the pink box is not correctly labeled. This is where we have some criticism being levied at the work. So we have reference to that author affiliation being a concern. So the pink is highlighting a point of concern. And then in blue, the last, those connections to our own research project. And the pink and the blue are very useful because what they're demonstrating is, again, that critical engagement, but we're also thinking about how this study is valuable to our own work. And the way, the degree in which it's valuable will likely dictate how prominently or not it will be featured in our literature review. Because I think the temptation when it comes to literature reviews is to cite everything that we read in order to show our reader that, yes, I did all of this research. The reality is we don't need to cite every study that we read because some of them just won't be that relevant. And readers rather, sometimes just get overwhelmed if there are too many citations, especially if there is a sense that you're padding with citations in order to communicate something about the amount of research that you did. So you always have to make choices about how you're going to feature the research that you've located. So we have a couple of links to advice on how to write an annotated bibliography. In brief, some of the most basic questions: what did the authors do? How did they do it? What did they discover? How did they interpret results? What criticisms do I have? And how does this project inform my own understanding or my own research? So ultimately, again, needs to be useful for you in order to inform whether or not you're going to want to reference that study in your literature review. Which ones do you want to spotlight or revisit? And I will acknowledge it can be time consuming, but it has the potential to save you time later on, especially if you've started to really generate some critique or some connections to your own work. So you'll be able to take some of that phrasing and adapt it for the actual review. So just final tips generally when it comes to analyzing and organizing your sources. Systems only work if you stick with them. So if you're someone who likes color coding, for instance, use it. If it doesn't help you, don't bother with it. If you need more or fewer columns, if you're using a table, for instance, you just adjust as you need it. What's important is consistency so that you are able to access the research that you were looking at easily without panicking and having to search for it again. because that just turns into a waste of time as well. Often some of these strategies can be used in complementary ways. You might favor some at different points in the research process. And ultimately, good note keeping is important because it will help reduce the risk of accidental plagiarism because you're going to be able to more easily reference where information came from. So thanks again for inviting me to today's session. Just a reminder of some of the services and supports that are available at the University Library. And I'm happy to stick around if there are any questions, or you can always send me an email, jill.mcmillan@usask.ca.
I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you very much. But we will open everything for questions and chat.